When we take notice of a sign, we immediately interact with what we recognize or remember about them, and when necessary, behave accordingly. Okay, what I mean is when we see that something is presented to us and we understand that what we're seeing is referring to something that itself is not explicitly present, we, without an explanation, might appreciate that we're looking at a sign. We encounter them everywhere and in just about any form where an idea can be communicated to a person or people. When you cross the road at a crossing, for example, you appreciate that the combination of symbols and colors represents when it's okay to cross safely. Where the presence of the person and color associated with that person, referring to the conventions and laws that inform that association, we know when it is our turn to move. Okay, before I go any further, I want to be clear about how I'm using that word here as well. So when I speak of signs, I do so in the semiotic sense as taken from the American philosopher Charles Peirce, who, within his approach to signs, defined it as anything which is so determined by something else, called its object, and so determines an effect upon a person, which effect I call its interpretant, that the latter is thereby immediately determined by the former. So put another way, a sign is something that serves as a visual representation of an idea or concept, in this sense, called an object, which through conventions and laws that create the need for the sign cause an effect to occur with a person or people, and that effect is called the interpretant. So in going back to the analogy I mentioned earlier, where everything we see at the crossing that tells us what to do and when is referring to the ideas which we are affected by ultimately in behaving in accordance with what the sign is telling us. At the same time, signs appear in our pop cultural space as well. So when a story comes along that celebrates those pieces of pop culture from the last 30 years or so, that is then adapted for the screen, we're being invited to partake of all these things again and in a new way. Repackaged in a different context, this is what Ready Player One does, in giving us hundreds of pop cultural signs for our enjoyment. It is enjoyment built on nostalgia, mediated by signs. While I think it's fairly safe to assume that we all know what the movie is about, I'll try to make this intro quick. Ready Player One is based on the book of the same name, the writer Ernest Cline having written the book and co-written the script with Zach Penn. The movie itself, directed by Steven Spielberg, presents a futurescape of Columbus, Ohio in the 2040s, where we follow Wade Watts as he tries to figure out the clues to a years-old contest that takes place inside of a massive virtual reality space called the Oasis. The movie has been filled from end to end with popular media from the last 30 years or so, popular soundtracks from the 70s and 80s as well as movies, and a scattering of more recent offerings in between. And whether you're an avid pop culture person or you saw The Shining once and I thought you'd take a crack at this film too, it potentially has something for everybody. And that's great, right? Kind of. It is a movie that, through the wholesale scattering of pop culture references, tries to cater to the widest possible audience. So if we were to take the crossing analogy and apply it to the first challenge in the film, where everything we see, the flag, the markers, the starting line, and the lights, all of it makes up the sign that tells us what it is referring to. Its interpretant for the races is the understanding and subsequent effect of positioning themselves according to the markers on the ground, oriented by the starting line for the race, as they wait for the green light. So the interpretant here might first be thought of as our association of the symbols we recognize to the meaning we take from them, resulting in an effect, which might be a response based on that recognition. The object in this case could probably be thought of as the concept of racing in general, a challenge or contest. It is the reason the sign and its interpretant are there at all. So while signs like the Iron Giant might denote pop cultural significance as a kind of replica, other signs can have more conceptual referential significance, as in the crossing or first challenge referring to laws about road use or use of the crossing, or just racing in general. To Peirce, this might be considered the difference between an immediate object which is directly embodied by the sign, as in the case of the Iron Giant, and the dynamic object, as in the race, which is, again, the idea or concept, a more immediate object and thus the sign is built on. In thinking about the sign as convention, Peirce described one such thing called a Legisign as a law that is a sign. It is not a single object, but a general type which, it has been agreed, shall be significant. Every Legisign signifies through an instance of its application which may be termed a replica of it. So in thinking about film convention, these things like setting, genre, and characterization do adhere to and become like law through conventional habit and association, ultimately as sign. The setting of the story is our near future. It features advanced technology. In this case, it already exists and is very popular, although the Oasis itself and access to it signals a somewhat more advanced version of what we have already. The film's visual design is often either cramped, dirty, or pristine and spacious by contrast, with the Oasis mostly being the latter, partly, among other reasons, to signal that the Oasis is where you want to be. It's clean there's room to be whatever, whoever, wherever. It is a visual contrast between the dystopian reality and the utopian virtual reality. They signal what kind of story they should expect to watch. The familiar habits and conventions that create the movie also have an effect on the audience it is marketed towards. Now, the characterization of Parzival is interesting as well, if only because he and Artemis are positioned to reproduce as many items of pop cultural significance as possible. They are characterized by their knowledge of pop culture and their love of it. It is interesting to note that the way that their function as repositories for pop nostalgia is given even greater importance, because obviously what matters most here is not really who these characters are, but what they can do in service of the main thing being pushed in Ready Player One. Counter to Parzival and Artemis is the characterization of the story's villain, Nolan Sorrento, who by contrast eschews pop cultural value in favor of the monetary value associated with it, although he, as a character, is taken to such an extreme, as seen when he basically blows up Wade's stack, that for us, he is someone whose values we should not agree with. The extreme he goes to makes it easier to malign him and everything he represents by association, but also makes it easier to align with Parzival and everything he represents and values. Each character's connection to the challenges requiring them to care about pop culture in an extreme fashion in order to reinforce that valuing of it, even with Sorrento showing to undermine it, is ultimately reinforcing it by the way he is coded as the villain. Now, sound in this film can invoke a kind of referential significance as well. The film still uses sound in the same way any other film would to convey meaning. The music playing during the first challenge both attempts to stress the danger and high stakes of the race as they pass various hazards.
There's 5 of us on the big board.
The light, up-tempo music playing during the montage at the end of it symbolizing triumph and celebration. These are all common parts in film that are needed in order to connect different shots, by referring to a meaning that they sometimes otherwise might have to the story the film is telling. In this way, film convention can serve to communicate in the same way that signs would, according to Peirce. These signs refer to a habit, a familiar way of telling the story at a general level.